Okay, everyone, I'm gonna let everybody come in, give everyone a few minutes to get settled, and then we will get started. So nice to see some familiar names. I love timely participants. As a former teacher, I hate when people come in late, even though I allow it on my Zoom events. Well, I'll let everybody file in. I'll go ahead and get us started because it's just the introductions. Hello, everyone. I'm Megan Anderson. I'm the events coordinator here at Park Road Books. We're so excited to have Karen L Cox and Ashli Stokes here tonight to discuss No Common Ground. The panelists this evening will have a conversation with each other, and for the first part of the event, we encourage you, if you have questions or comments that come up as they're conversing, to put them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. It's got two little chat bubbles and it says Q&A. You can submit questions and comments there. And at the end of the event, the last 15 minutes, we will get to those and discuss them and bring them to the attention of Karen and Ashli. We also would love if you would like a copy of No Common Ground. We have signed copies at Park Road Books. We can ship them, we can deliver them to you, we can do curbside, we can pretty much get them to you any way you would like. And if you'd like a personalization, I'm sure Karen would come down and inscribe further. And then lastly, before I introduce our lovely author and host, I need to remind everyone that Park Road Books has a zero tolerance policy in regards to harassment of any form. So if you harass anyone in this setting, you'll be expelled from this event and further events in the future. We haven't had any incidents of that so far in our virtual event landscape, but let's not make this one be the first one. I'm sure we'll have no problems. So that being said, I'd like to introduce our guests. Karen L. Cox is an award-winning historian, distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians, and a professor of history at UNC Charlotte. A successful public intellectual, she has written op-eds for the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, Time, and more, and so many more. Dr. Cox regularly gives media interviews on the subject of Southern history and culture and is the author of 4 books, including No Common Ground. Dreaming of Dixie, How the South Was Created in American Popular Culture, and Goat Castle, a true story of murder, race, and the Gothic South. Our host is Ashli Stokes. She is a professor of communication studies at UNC Charlotte. Her award-winning research examines advocacy, identity, and activism in the areas of food, health, corporate social responsibility, and public communication. She recently edited City Places, Country Spaces, and co-authored Consuming Identity. Her research has been featured in academic outlets and includes 4 books, while she also contributes to local and national media such as the Smithsonian, Academic Minute, and NPR. She is a Fulbright scholar, and she receives external funding from the North Carolina Humanities Council and other agencies to support her research. Stokes teaches courses on Southern foodways, rhetoric, and public advocacy. We're so lucky to have both these academics here tonight to discuss No Common Ground. So let's sit back, enjoy this conversation. If you have questions and comments, please put them in the Q&A feature so we can get to them at the end. Go ahead, guys.
Okay, great. Well, I will start us off. I want to thank Park Road Books for having us, and especially I want to thank Karen for inviting me to do this with her. And, before we get started, I think it's really important for me to take a minute, for us to take a minute to acknowledge the Derek Chauvin verdict that came down, an hour and a half ago. And we're going to spend some time, I think, talking about that very important issue this evening. And in fact, one of the things that I wanted to start off with is Karen and I have been friends for several years now. And what's been really neat about that as another professor is I get to hear about how projects develop. And so right before everything shut down in Charlotte, Karen and I went out one evening for dinner and a drink, and we were talking about this project. And she said to me, she's like, gosh, I'm having a hard time. Like, this is a difficult topic to write about. And she had just gotten back from traveling to the Southern Poverty Law Center in Mississippi and the Equal Justice Initiative. And so anyway, we were talking a lot about some of the challenges she faced kind of early on in her research and writing about that. And so Karen, one of the things that we talked about is, I think you were a little hesitant at first to write about this topic for several reasons, but then you became, over time, it was important for you to tell the story that you tell in this book. So I wonder if you could just kind of orient us all to the conversation by talking about how this story came to you and why eventually you thought that it was something that you really needed to do.
All right. Well, thank you, Ashli. It's great to be with you. And thank you for doing this with me. And thank Park Road Books for hosting this event. Yeah, it wasn't something that I had looked forward to writing about. I had researched a completely different book. But the subject of Confederate monuments, which was something I had visited in my first book on the United Daughters of the Confederacy several years ago, kept coming back. And over the last several years, especially since the Charleston massacre in 2015, I felt like I started writing more publicly about it. And I think between the public writing and then the public talks I was giving around the issue, eventually I just decided I had to do it. And I felt something of a moral responsibility, a responsibility as a historian who knows this probably better than anybody, to write the history of these statues. And so I got a little push from UNC Press, who's the publisher. And then I just had a little talk with myself and said, you're going to do this, go, do it. It is a heavy topic, though. As you said, it's something hard to kind of carry around with you.
And, we're going to get to that in a little bit. And I think one way to maybe start that process is, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the first part of the book's title, which is No Common Ground. Mm-hmm. And, as we've seen in the last year and many, throughout the decades, and you tell the story very well, there's such a disconnect, right, about what Confederate monuments mean. And so, how did you name the book? Why did you feel like that phrase was important to kind of express what you were trying to get about in covering this debate in this story?
Right. So the debate has been really clear since the 19th century. It's like, people are on one side or the other. And in the South, it's generally, the white community of the South and then the Black community of the South have been on opposite sides of what these monuments mean. And, some folks may think that, it's only a recent phenomenon over the last several years as they've seen removals, but these competing interpretations have gone back well over a century. And there's never, and this is part of the title, there's never common ground on what they mean. There's no point of agreement. So there's that element of it. And then it has a double meaning in the book, which is that that no common ground is about the ground on which these monuments sit, whether that's, on Monument Avenue in Richmond, or primarily it's those on the courthouse lawn, in government spaces, whether it's the courthouse or the state capitol grounds. And so that should be common ground, a democratic space, but it's not. As long as these statues are there and are divisive, these spaces don't feel welcoming to African Americans.
Mm-hmm. And that's one thing that I'm a scholar more of contemporary issues, and so I really like, for me, that you give me a lot of the sort of all of the things that led to some of the things that we're talking about and experiencing now. And one of the things that I particularly liked is your focus on sort of community-based monuments rather than a battlefield. I'm a Virginian, there's a big culture of talking about battlefields and Confederate and Northern and all of that. But I think that community focus is really important. And I wondered if you could talk about here in Charlotte, Harvey Gantt's role and the focus that you put on him about how he played a role in talking about whether or not Charlotte was going to have a Confederate monument out front of city halls back in the 70s. And, I think that for me as a Charlottean now, Harvey's kind of an example of what how to talk about someone who's affected by these decisions. So can you tell us a little bit about the Harvey Gantt episode and story in your book?
Yeah, well, Harvey Gantt to me is representative of this legacy of African-American critique of Confederate monuments and other symbols like the battle flag. And so as I was doing my research and I stumbled upon his name, that obviously jumped right out at me. And to find out that it's really kind of about his pre-mayoral, history there. A lot of people know about him being mayor, or they might know about his desegregation of Clemson University. But in the 1970s, it was the first political office he had held, and it was the city council. And in 1977, there was a group called the Confederate Memorial Society that sought to place a monument on the grounds of City Hall, which is now we say it's Old City Hall. And so I want to tell that story because Harvey Gantt kind of represents the first generation of African-American representatives, government officials since Reconstruction that had been elected to office. And part of that is because of the Voting Rights Act of 65, and people, Black Southerners are able to elect officials that look like them. So I don't want to tell the whole story because I want people to read about it. Sure. But needless to say, I mean, the fact that Harvey Gantt, Confederate monuments have been placed in public spaces and on the grounds of government for well over a century, even when he took office. So when he takes office, he represents a new generation of Black Southerners who are saying, hold up just a second, this is not appropriate. And so it goes ahead, and it is already placed on the grounds when they start to have the conversation. But what we learn about this episode and about Harvey Gantt is what happens when people are not transparent about what they're doing, and it usually comes back to bite them. And in this case, it was this kind of backroom deal to get this Confederate marker out on the lawn of City Hall, and Harvey Gantt spoke so eloquently during these meetings of the City Council that he obviously shamed people. You could tell that there were people and you can read it in the book. But he's just significant in that he kind of represents this hope of a new generation, and also the fact that now that you can elect public officials that look like you, if you're from the Black community, then you can have them represent your point of view on issues like Confederate monuments.
Mm-hmm. I definitely, when I was reading that passage, what I was struck by as a communication studies scholar is that so my field, we look at language choices, right? And we look at what they mean and what they do. And one of the things that we write about is, and I think that you see that really clearly in the debate over Confederate monuments, is the use of this sort of us versus them language, or this is my history and your heritage, and so on and so forth. And so what we talk about is that, people use those phrases and those words to create, identification with someone else, to create, ideally common ground, or to relate to somebody. But when you create common ground with somebody, with one group, what my field says is you push away another group, that it serves that divisive, outcome, if you will. And so I was really struck about how some of that language played out in your book. Like this Confederate history is my history, or this is white history, and then sort of the struggle to kind of broaden that narrative. So when you were in the archives, and I want to talk a little bit about methodology, how did you see that language and those choices in your research?
It really stood out to me, and a lot of this is happening post Voting Rights Act, that because it's the first time Confederate symbols are getting challenged, and the reason they're getting challenged is because people like Harvey Gantt and others who are now representing people of color in communities across the South, and you see people saying, hey, we might not want that battle flag there or that Confederate monument here. And what you begin to see right away is that the public debates that go on in the community, and generally through the newspapers, letters to the editor, they're really talking in these sort of this like us versus them, my culture versus your culture. I mean, someone wrote in the paper, or maybe it was in the city council minutes, and they said to Harvey Gantt, you have your memorial to Martin Luther King Jr. And we want one for our heritage. It's like, you get one, you get MLK, but then what they're not saying is like, it's not just one and one, it's not just one memorial. Across the South, it's the landscape of the South is saturated with Confederate memorials. It's not just monuments, street names, it's markers, it's school names, names of the highways. I mean, you can't hardly, swing a stick without hitting a Confederate memorial.
I mean, yeah, I'm smiling simply because, I grew up in Southwest Virginia, so not Richmond, and there's a big difference, right, in those parts of the state. And we all joke about it, but when I was reading your book is that iconography is so much a part of what I grew up with, what I experienced, and what I don't think I really understood, the names of the roads and what I was looking at into much later in my life. And, I wonder if, you talk about like, these symbols are not innocuous symbols, right? That they have become weaponized. And so can you talk a little bit about like, maybe how over particular time periods they were weaponized for different reasons, how they came to mean certain things, that type of thing?
Sure. I mean, the thing is about especially like the earliest monuments that are going on the courthouse grounds, these are places where there's, again, supposed to be democratic spaces, but it happens to be this same history is also the history of lynching in the South, and lynchings can take place on the courthouse lawn, and there's lots of evidence of that happening adjacent to these monuments. And there's a story that I'm really mad that I didn't get included in this book, and I think it just got lost in in me working so hard to get this book out, which was there was a lynching in Burke County in Morganton area, in 1927. Lynchings are generally, there's some sort of, it's a black man who's supposedly, done something to a white woman or touched inappropriate or whatever. There's always a reason. It's usually around that. And so there was, a bunch of people went, it was a manhunt for this guy, and they finally catch up with him and they shoot him, they kill him, but they bring the body back to Morganton. And what they decide to do is lay the body on the steps of the Confederate monument. And 5,000 people from Burke County come to be part of that spectacle. And there's no way you could not understand the connections between white supremacy and these monuments and the white supremacy that caused that lynching. They're like making it pretty clear for you. Mm-hmm. So there's those kinds of things early on, and when ways it gets weaponized, it gets, obviously it's being weaponized during the civil rights movement. What's interesting is civil rights activists and marchers who are out to register voters start to push back on that. They start to reclaim the space around these monuments, because they know what they mean. They know what they've been what they've meant to the Black community. And then obviously most recently events in Charlottesville, where, you know, white nationalists show up to, under the pretense of defending the removal of the Lee Monument. And it's weaponized again, but in you know, in a way that's so violent, even more, you know, it's always usually around violence and racial violence very often. But, you know, and someone, you know, obviously got killed in Charlottesville. Somebody died there. And then, of course, you know, last summer when George Floyd was murdered. And we know that in the South, the way protests erupted was to go after Confederate monuments, because they recognize those same issues at play in these monuments: the systemic racism, the white supremacy, and even police brutality.
Yeah, and that actually was going to be my next question, is that, you know, if we've talked about kind of the first part of the title, the no common ground, you know, the second part is the Confederate monuments and the ongoing fight for racial justice. And, you know, it's kind of, I don't know, it's important and sort of maybe unique that this conversation happens today. And I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of how you see, you know, we've got the verdict coming down today, and some other ways that you see specifically the debate about, or the debate over monuments, its connections to systemic racism, its connections to voter suppression. And so, you know, there's a tendency, you know, media reporting trends will focus on just George Floyd, right? Or we'll focus on just the perpetrator, right? Or we'll focus on just the institution and how it's upheld, the courts, for example.
Right.
So can you kind of, like, from a historical perspective, talk us through how monuments play into kind of supporting that racist system?
Yeah, so, you know, it's no coincidence that Confederate monuments ended up on the grounds of courthouses and state capitals. These are where laws are made. And when they were going in, this is the era of Jim Crow, early Jim Crow, they were also what's going on inside those buildings is the either legalizing of segregation within these among these lawmaking bodies. Or it's also, you know, places where, you know, if you're an individual, you can't, you know, an African American, you can't really expect that you're going to receive justice inside the building that out on the front lawn where the Confederate monument is standing. So there, you know, issues like that that I see, you know, that we see happening, and so the injustice is just the physical presence of these monuments on these grounds and what that means to the Black community, the divisiveness that it represents. And again, like, you know, in places like Richmond, obviously it's much more significant. I mean, that the entire landscape is just covered in this stuff. And in the most, you know, there's only one left to go, you know, and that's the one to Robert E. Lee, but that is also in litigation. So I think it, you know, as I say in the book, these things are not static. There are messages that come, you know, that people get from these monuments, whether you're on the defender side or you're on the side that wants to see them removed. You know, they're, you know, the messages of race and heritage for one group is opposite of what it means for, you know, African Americans who've always said, you know, seeing these things as representing, you know, honoring men who perpetuated slavery. And, you know, it's a Jim Crow monument. A lot of people, you know, we call them Jim Crow monuments. And more recently, people just like, again, the message is, you know, if you've ever stood in front of some of these monuments, they're enormous, some of them, you know, they're, you know, 20, 30, 40, 50 feet in the air. I think that, you know, the one in, you know, the Lee Monument in Richmond is unbelievable in its size. And so I think all those things like have a role to play. You know, you can't just, it's why you can't just put up a contextual panel, which has been some of the, thoughts around, like, what do you do with these things if you're not going to remove them? I mean, a 4 by 6 foot panel with some writing on it, standing next to a 30-foot monument, there's an optics problem here, and there's an inequality in the way that looks. So this is part of the reason, I think that ship has sailed.
Yeah, I'm really struck by, you talk about in the book how, the message is sort of unmistakable about who makes the laws, right? If you're standing in the courthouse square and you see such a large, imposing item, I see your point about offering a little contextual panel, comes with some drawbacks. And I want to get back to that in a little bit about, so what do we do about these things? But I want to say that for a little bit later in the discussion. And one of the things that I was struck by too, and kind of preparing for this talk is, Elon University did a poll a few years ago about what North Carolinians in particular thought about monuments. And so on April 8th of this year, I just happened to catch that the number of North Carolinians in favor, and I'll look at my notes for just a second, of removing monuments from public spaces increased from 35% to 42%. But the survey also found evidence of further polarization, on this issue, and said to the effect of, while 1/3 of residents said that the killing of George Floyd and other events in 2020 made them more in favor of removing the monuments, about 1/6 of the respondents said that the last year in 2020 had made them less favorable towards removal. And from a historian's point of view, so as a rhetorician, I would talk about the media coverage and, the symbolic message of things. But I wondered if you could speak to how, like, the sort of lingering elements of the lost cause narrative is still pushing into that polarization. Like, what is it going to take to get us to 50% of people wanting it gone? You know what I mean?
I don't know, but I think, when they kind of downplayed those numbers a little bit in their initial report by, suggesting that it's like, oh, a majority of North Carolinians still, don't want to see these things removed. But what they didn't say is, like, between the time, like, I had earlier figures on this in the book, and then of course this comes out right after I published the book. But
that's the way it always happens.
Yeah. So, but there's a 7% change, and is not insignificant.
Right.
And so there's I think that our public discussions around this issue, certainly George Floyd's murder had something to do with this in moving the needle in this poll. But also, I think, as you pointed out, this lost cause narrative has a chokehold on a lot of people. Not so much, I think, not the 18 to 34 group, which is part of the group that's in this polling data, but it's people older than that, and people who kind of think of this as some sort of benign history, and they don't, it's like, what's wrong with that? It's just a monument. It's just about heritage or whatever.
Yeah, that's all back there, kind of.
Yeah, it's like it doesn't mean much, but obviously it means a lot and it has meant a lot over the long history of these statues to the Black community.
One of the things I think that might be useful, though, to some viewers and listeners, and I think you do a really good job of this in the book, but for those who are unfamiliar, can you talk about what people, I feel like, have always kind of shared the phrase, oh, it's a lost cause narrative, right? This is what it is, right? Yeah. For years, you kind of hear that sort of in casual conversation. So for those who are new to this discussion and want to find out more about it, can you talk about, like, what it is and maybe some suggestions about how, in addition to your work, where could they find out more about that?
Yeah, so the lost cause is this narrative that developed after the Civil War. After Confederate defeat, white Southerners were at a loss as to how to explain that loss. They went into the war feeling like, that they were going to win this thing. And so after being soundly defeated, they had to kind of make sense of that. First of it was Edward Pollard wrote this. He was Richmond journalist. He wrote a book called The Lost Cause. It kind of coins the term. But in it, what he's saying is that our cause is still just. And how, we may, all that's been decided here is that we've been, is military defeat and nothing more. Like, we still cling to our values, and what the values of that in the absence of slavery is white supremacy. So the lost cause develops, and it's like, there's certain parts of the narrative, and it gets built on, and but the main one is that the Civil War was not fought about slavery, it was fought over states' rights. That's like one of the main ones. Or, that the system of slavery is something, was like some sort of benevolent institution, or, and then of course all Confederate soldiers and all their, Confederate military leaders come off as romantic heroes. And a lot of this is about vindicating their reputation for having been defeated. So that lots of this narrative, and there's different elements of this. Again, there's narrative, part of it's about Reconstruction, and even romanticizing the original Ku Klux Klan for saving, the white South. That gets perpetuated onto future generations. There's a real early on in the decades after the Civil War, an effort to say, okay, we've got to teach this to future generations. And so that gets repeated several generations, including, and so that you do still have people who believe in the narrative of the lost cause.
Thank you for that.
It's really it's been a powerful narrative that we've not been able to, get ourselves out of. And so, we have, as a historian, I'm in an uphill battle, against it. Right. But I'm doing my best, writing the books. So my book talks about, but there's a lot of historians that write about this. As probably one of the best descriptions of it is Adam Dombey's book, The False Cause, that came out last year from UVA Press. I think that's like one of the best descriptions I've ever read. I think he does a great job with that. I've certainly written about it before in my first book. So people can learn about this in a variety of places, including just going online and finding, like a good encyclopedia article will kind of fill you in on the details.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to kind of think about sort of, what that history is and what it means today and how we got to where we are right now. Because I loved in your book, you talk about like how in World War II, the monuments are sort of symbols for patriotism against communism, and you trace sort of how that mythology kind of plays out in the different decades and time periods. And so I think having that background is really important. I've got, I think I'm kind of running down on some of my time, but I have a couple more questions I do want to try to get to. And one of those is, my field, we talk a lot about rhetorical strategies, right? So strategies of persuasion, how it is that you get someone on your side. And so, a lot of what I noticed in the book that fascinates me is this, and you use the strategy name of co-optation, right? So you have the different sides saying, things like they're talking back to Harvey Gantt, for example, and they're saying that, Harvey Gantt is voting against the supposed rights for everyone, right? And wanting to have the monument not there, or that people who aren't, able to kind of leave monuments alone are suppressing kind of a tolerance of culture. Sort of the adoption of the phrase by the other side, if you will. So can you talk about some of the ways you saw that sort of co-optation playing out? I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, that's like, anytime there's a push for racial progress, there is a backlash, and often the people who criticize it or upset about it co-opt their language. So for example, in Harvey Gantt saying, we can't have this monument on the grounds of City Hall. This is not a good look in the New South, and especially in a diverse city like Charlotte. And people say, his critics would say, he doesn't believe in equality.
Right.
Okay. Or, you know, later on, it would be like during a period of multiculturalism, when we get the word like African American, you know, people start using the word Confederate American.
Mhm.
You know, there's, you know, and a lot of this is just to diminish progress
Mhm.
and kind of diminish the movements for progress.
Mhm.
When you know, Black Lives Matter emerged in 2014, you had either Southern Lives Matter, which is in that group's definition would be white people, and then or Confederate Lives Matter. I saw that as well, and so, you know, and so what they're doing is trying to take away attention away from that racial progress and return it to white people, white authority, white power structures.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I've looked at in my work, because when people often say Southern food, what they really mean is white Southern food,
Mhm.
right? And so you see a very similar dynamic happening, whether it's over a monument or whether it's over food. I actually saw on a research trip recently, I went to Blowing Rock and Boone, and someone had scrawled right before the presidential election, Southern Appalachian Lives Matter, which again defaults to white. So
Yeah,
here's my
always.
question.
Okay.
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, that's good.
I mean, it's just really interesting how, you know, everyone wants to be on the winning side, right? So that language kind of has that function to kind of get you there. So here's the thing. So, you know, we're both academics, right?
Yeah,
So we
I think
see these
so.
things. What's that?
I think we are. Okay,
I
go
think
ahead.
maybe sometimes. So you know, what's the role for what's the role for academics like us who work in archives and who analyze text and pertaining to social justice? And also, you know, what do you say to readers who say, "Look, listen, Karen, you are a white woman of privilege. You know, what are you going to do about this?" So, you know, I think it's, what do we do about that? What do we do as, what's our role as academics in this fight?
I think that what we've got to do is bring our skills to bear on the subject. So as a historian, what I'm going to do is like, I'm not, you know, obviously I'm writing a book, but I'm writing a book based on the primary source material, which is what historians do. Whether it's the archives or the newspapers or, you know, oral history interviews. And so if I say, these monuments represent white supremacy, someone say, oh, that's just your opinion, right? Somebody could be mad about that. But when I like actually have the speeches that were, given at unveiling of monuments, that where they actually lay it out for you and say, these men after the Civil War were defenders of the white race, were defenders of Anglo-Saxon supremacy. They say it. And, and we had a monument here behind the Grady Cole Center that wasn't from, it's not city owned, it was county owned. That was put there in 1929 after a veterans reunion of Confederate veterans. And they actually, on the monument itself, it actually uses the words Anglo-Saxon supremacy. We're honoring them for doing this. So, it's about bringing that evidence to bear on the subject so that people, you can't ignore the evidence.
Right.
I mean, that we're living in a time where people, question facts. So you've got to be really careful, and you got to, bring that evidence to bear on the topic. And that's what I try to do. It's not just that I think it's so. It's like, I know it is because I've done the research and here's the evidence. And as much as possible, I quote the people who I'm talking about.
Yes, definitely. Given that sort of first person kind of take on the situation.
Yeah.
I have so many things I want to talk about. I want to talk about monument protection laws, and I want to talk about, what's the best way to kind of get this information out to a social media, desiring age. But I'm trying to keep an eye on the topic. So I thought maybe one way that we could do this and kind of cover some of this stuff is you have a part about the Harvey Gantt story at the very end of your book. And so we haven't done, traditional book reading because of Zoom and all this stuff, but, could you maybe do like a little bit of a reading from the end of your book and then maybe talk about like sort of reflect on what Gant sees as the struggle over monument, and then where the sort of common ground debate might be heading next.
Okay, so I'd marked a couple of spaces. It's like about what does all this mean? So this is toward the end in the epilogue, and I write that in the thick of the debates over monument removal in the summer of 2020, I can't believe as a historian I was writing about this like a month after. This is not the way historians work. Okay. But in that, if I was thinking about those debates, I sat down with Harvey Gantt, the well-respected Black political figure who had long ago been part of the movement to challenge monuments. Our conversation began with a discussion of the debate over placing a Confederate monument in Charlotte on the grounds of City Hall in 1977 and his opposition to it. Eventually, we settled into talking about the very important role that history education has in how we see the past and sometimes past one another. Mm-hmm. And then I just kind of closed the chapter about that because I think what he had to say was he's very much a historian in his thinking, I think. What Harvey Gantt described to me in August 2020 helps explain why there is no common ground in the debate over Confederate monuments. In the simplest of terms, it's about competing versions of history. One is based in fact in the centrality of slavery to the Civil War and of white supremacy in the building of monuments. The other is based on a fabricated account of a battle over states' rights, stripped of the ugliness of slavery, which massages the truth as a means of dealing with Confederate defeat and regards monuments as honoring a just cause and a virtuous heritage. For more than 150 years, the erroneous version of the past has dominated the culture of the South. But as the removal of monuments since 2015 suggests, the lost causes days may be numbered. And with that, perhaps there is common ground ahead. So I really think it is. I do think this is about like how we learn history and what we're learning in the classrooms. I mean, when I have students come into my classroom at UNC Charlotte and I ask them, what did you learn about the Civil War? And they say that it was about states' rights. I've got a problem, right? And somehow the message that, of what we're learning and reading and writing about is not necessarily reaching all students. I'm not going to say it's, but the students in the South, it seems to be, they're not getting this message. So one of the ways to do it, I think, is not, I don't expect, a high school student necessarily to pick up my book and read it. They could, and they might learn a lot from it. But one of the ways that I try to reach, younger people and talk and thinking about history is to use media. To be, to do interviews or to talk. But one of the things I did this just a couple months ago was I helped to develop a TED Ed talk, a TED Ed lesson called Debunking the Lost Cause Myth. And I also accepted, to do an interview with Vox News a few years ago about the United Daughters of the Confederacy. That Vox video has been seen almost 4 million times. It's just insane. And even the TED Ed lesson, which is just out a couple months ago, has been watched 500,000 times. This is not for, adults. This is like younger people are looking at this. There are some teacher resources there. And so that's where I feel like I can, I got to read. We can't just say, adults are having a good conversation about this like we're tonight. We really got to reach people, as the old people say, we got to reach the young people. We really do.
I think it's a really important point that we can end on, because, the public memory we have about these things, as we would call it in my field, it's not neutral. And until that presentation of the history changes in whatever sort of medium that it needs to change in, so with Vox or whatever else, I mean, that's offering the deeper, the other side, whatever you want to call it. But I do think it's important to realize that the way these lessons are presented, right? They matter, right? In changing the way that we memorialize the past and think about the past. So I think that we're at maybe 7:45-ish. So I don't know if it's time to maybe open up, because I want to make sure that our folks have time to ask other things.
We have a few questions, so now is a great time to do that. One of the first questions that we got is, while I see you started writing this book in 2019, did you feel an urgency to get this book out after the summer, or did you have a different catalyst and these just sort of coincided? So I think it's really like an origins question.
Yeah, so I signed a contract. 2019 turns out it was the second anniversary of the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, and I'd written an op-ed for the New York Times. And that's when the press, knocked on my door again and said, "Don't you want to write this book?" And I finally caved into doing it. And then, I wasn't finished writing it when the George Floyd murder happened, and then the protests of last summer happened. I was like, history was being made as I was trying, finishing the book. So I might have finished the book with a discussion of Charlottesville. It might have ended there, but the epilogue took me into a different direction. And so that's, and then plus I was on a time schedule to get it out. There was that too. So I had to work pretty hard to get it done.
Well, we're glad you did. So it's out, but understandable. This sort of is connected to that question. So another person asked, what were the largest challenges of writing about history that seems to be so presently changing? Yeah, I mean, obviously your epilogue is completely different.
Yeah, the epilogue is very different. I mean, and let's be honest, Charlottesville is very recent history.
Yes.
I have to remind people yesterday was history, but can you write about, and so I think that we're, historians are, not thought to be writing about things that are contemporary, but the thing is I've become really public facing scholar in terms of what work I want to do and trying to reach people. And so what that means is I'm often reacting to things that are happening right now. Right. So when Charlottesville happened, I responded with an op-ed or a couple of op-eds, and to give people the historical context for what was happening right then. And so that's, so I had some experience doing that already, I think. And so I wasn't completely knocked, off kilter by what was happening last summer.
And if I could just jump in for a second, I think that's one of the reasons that when you read the book, that, perhaps young people in particular see this as, oh gosh, this is Charlottesville, or, oh, the horrible situation surrounding George Floyd. And what you see is, the story you tell about, is it Tuskegee, where the young man, the scenario, he gets shot. And so you see then the counter protests happening after that. And I'll let you share a little bit about the excerpt. But in other words, I think those stories show, the scenarios show how, Charlottesville and all these other things, these aren't, these are all connected, right? And if you go back in time, you see where they come from, particularly for younger folks.
Yeah.
I see. Presently changing or repeating, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
So another person asked, do you see a correlation between the lost cause and the big lie?
There's certainly a lot going on about that. Yeah, there is. I do see a correlation. I wrote an op-ed about that, about Trump and the lost cause, because I feel like, the lost cause is sort of its own big lie. After the Civil War, it's like, oh, we didn't fight a war to perpetuate slavery. Yes, you did, because, it was in, secession ordinances. And even, the vice president of the Confederacy gave something called the Cornerstone speech, in which he says the cornerstone of this new government is slavery, this belief in the subordination of what he would have said, the Negro, or, something like that. So, yes, there are those things, because what happens is the lost cause is about, is sort of the big lies, is we're gonna like create a different narrative here to get us out of that, right? And so Trump's defeat is, now that we're like, we're only not that far out of it, there's a lot of like rewriting the narrative about what happened. And so, yes, there is a lot of, there are a lot of similarities here.
Another person asks, how do you respond to people, and this seems like a personal question, but related to your field, how do you respond to people who say things like they don't want to erase history, especially if you're trying to seek common ground?
Right. So first of all, no monument ever taught a history lesson. That's one thing. Monuments are, and one of the things to be clear about this, monuments are memorials. They're not history texts, they're not books, they're memorials. And key as part of that word is memorial, is memory, and memories are faulty. And so this is not what's happening. So very often monuments, and it doesn't matter if it's a Confederate monument, or the World War II memorial in DC, these monuments are really are about the generation that puts them there. It's about them. There's like, oh, we better do this to, as a way of means of honoring our ancestors. We better do this, or we're going to look bad if we don't do something like that. The other part of it is like, the way that which the UDC approached monument building, it wasn't just about the past. It was really like about the future. They saw these as teaching tools, and so, and the other thing about these monuments is that they become ritualized. Every Confederate Memorial Day, there might be, there were speeches given, and children were very much a part of all this stuff. It's not history. And if I'm not worried about losing the history here, because these are, first of all, these monuments represent the history of Jim Crow more than the Civil War. And the other thing is that we'll always, you can always, there's photographs of these monuments and postcards of these monuments. There's speeches that were given, and big shock, there are history books out there, and and so and there's archives. You don't even have to take my word for it. You could go into your local library, go to your state archive. You would learn a bunch of history about those monuments. So history is not being erased.
I feel like that's super obvious when you read just a small excerpt of this text, because I did, but yeah, people talk. Someone wrote it was interesting the distinction you made about the size of, I think they meant plaque, and the size of a statue. And obviously you were specifically speaking to one, but it exists across the board in others. Did anything interesting come up in your research about the design of monuments?
Well, there's a couple of ways to think about this. One is that many of these like the common soldier monuments, those were mass produced. They're kind of cookie cutter monuments. But the monuments that are, much more involved and more expensive, those that are at the state capitals, or maybe in battlefield parks, or even in the one in Arlington National Cemetery, the UDC actually had, competitions for artists, sculptors to come up with designs. So there are some pretty, I'm not going to say they're not magnificent. Some of them are magnificent. I mean, in terms of, just their artistic merit. And so those definitely exist. But I mean, the messages behind them is what makes them problematic.
And then this is a question I always ask my authors to wrap things up. If people read No Common Ground and they wanted to read more, where would you send them? Like, what are your, obviously you would send them to the archive.
I'll read more about, I was going to say, send them to Park Road Books to buy it. What do you mean?
You're right. This is it. That's all they can read.
So no, they would, you want to learn more about the subject of monuments,
Yes.
you're saying? Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of books out there right now. I mean, it seemed like, every Tom, Dick, and Harry wants to, write a book about monuments. I'm not joking. I mean, it's like every time I turn around, it's like, oh, you want a piece of this too? But like what I have in my back pocket is that I've been doing this for over 30 years. So I think I know a little bit more than most people. So, but there are some good books out there. I'm not going to lie about that. Adam Dombey's The False Cause is a great book. What other? I mean, some of these are just now coming out. I mean, again, in part because of what's of current events. And so you've got art historians writing about it. You got political scientists writing about it, the historians,
different angles. Yeah.
And then there are journalists, and then there are people like that, just like trying, like they just write, they just pop out a book probably every 6 months, and that's those people are writing about it. So there's a lot of that going on right now.
Well, we will put yours in front of theirs.
Thank you, as you should.
At Park Road Books, we support Dr. Karen Cox. I don't know if anyone else on this heard her WFAE interview here in Charlotte, but it was on at the store, and we were very excited. We told every customer about the event. So that wraps it up for tonight. I want to thank you, Karen, and you, Ashli, so much for a very interesting conversation. Incredibly relevant, incredibly great to speak about today. I want to remind everyone, as I have several times, that you can purchase the book signed from us at Park Road Books. You can do it online. You can come in the store with a mask. We'll ship anywhere. We've shipped all over the world. And if you'd like a personalization, we can get that done as well. Thank you guys so much for coming and your participation and your comments. And again, thank you, Karen and Ashli, so much for a wonderful conversation. We appreciate it so much. Everyone go out and buy No Common Ground and give it as a gift to everyone else.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye.